It was April 1945 and there was good news coming to Hogan and his men almost hourly. Each and every day there was news of some ally coming closer and closer to the men of Stalag 13. Unfortunately for the men, Hamburg was only a few miles from the camp and Germany had made it their plan to hold out as long as they could. The fighting was intense and each and every day something new was bombed. This did not ease the work for the men under Hogan's command. As a matter of fact, the Germans were now desperate and had doubled down on the guards. Even Klink now had a man at the office 24 hours a day. Hogan could tell that the colonel was very worried about what was going on. Colonel Klink's stuttering had gotten much worse and he just wrung his hands. As for Hans Schultz, he was happy with the news. He had never been interested in the war and just wanted to get back to making toys. But, now his country was all but destroyed and he no longer had a home. His wife and little boy were living on the street now and he was getting desperate. Somehow, Schultz hoped that perhaps Robert Hogan would have mercy on him and not encourage the enemy to shoot him. He figured that he would have to spend many years in jail for the time he had spent as a Nazi sergeant. But, anything was better than the life he now had. He had nothing, his family had nothing, and starvation was now a reality. Once more the sirens were going off, letting the prisoners know that the enemy was coming close and would be unloading bombs on the city nearby. The siren was a daily thing now and Schultz headed to Hogan's barracks to secure it. His job was to make sure that during the raids the men stayed inside. Newkirk was climbing out of the tunnel as he heard the sirens go off. He turned quickly to close the trap door, knowing that Schultz would be there in a matter of minutes. But, after 5 years of Schultz seeing many things, the secret of Hogan and his men was displayed right in front of his very eyes. As Sergeant Schultz opened the door, he saw Newkirk standing at an open bunk and could clearly see a ladder leading into the underground. So, they had been doing things without his knowledge, he thought to himself. His first thoughts were to grab his gun and bring Hogan and his men to Klink's office. But, no, this was no longer an option. He knew that the Germans had very little time left before the Allies arrived at the Stalag and he wanted to negotiate with Hogan. For the past 3 years Hogan had been so careful to make sure that no one found out about his tunnels or his work, and just a few short weeks of freedom he had been discovered. Hogan and Newkirk looked at Schultz and waited for some kind of sign on how the sergeant was going to handle the situation. Schultz stood in the doorway for what seemed to be a long time and placed his gun on the floor next to the door. He said, "Colonel Hogan, I would like to talk to you in private, please." Hogan nodded his head and opened the door to his room. As the men watched, they closed the door behind them. Each and every one of them knew that their fate was now in the hand of their colonel and Sergeant Schultz. Schultz took a seat and started to speak. "Colonel Hogan, I know that you and I have been enemies for the past several years. Sometimes things have not been that good here for you or for me. I know that I got to go home once in a while and you did not, but I have seen my country destroyed both inside and outside. I am a toy maker. I have a wife and son who are homeless, living on the streets and starving slowly to death. Even I cannot give them all the food they need. I give you my word that this will go no further than between you and me if you could somehow arrange for my wife and child to escape to a safe haven." This was going to be a tough call. Hogan knew that he couldn't allow Schultz out of the barracks with the information that he now held. But, that would mean the killing of a man that he had known for 5 years. He knew that many times Schultz had looked the other way, and perhaps if it hadn't been for Schultz things could not have gone so well for him and his men. He made the decision to aid this German who had laid down his gun at the door. Out loud Hogan said, "All right Schultz, I will help you. Tonight you and I will go into town and find your wife and son. I will see to it that they have safe passage. Because, of what you have seen, you cannot go back to the camp. I will arrange for you and your family to reach freedom tomorrow night when a submarine will arrive." Schultz couldn't believe his ears. All he could say is, "You can contact a submarine?" He was shocked. Hogan let it go and went into the outer room to talk to his men. There was a reaching of an agreement, and with that Newkirk opened the door to Colonel Hogan's room and said, "Come on in Schultz. We are all in the same boat together now, man. Klink was in his office when he heard the siren go off once again. It was each and every day and he was getting sick to his stomach, wondering what was going to happen to him when the Allies arrived. Would Hogan give him a good rap? No, Hogan hated him. He had been so strict about no escape and had been hard on them on many other things. He was down in the bunker with the other guards when he noticed that Schultz wasn't down there. It was strange, as Sergeant Schultz was always one of the first men to go down there. Like himself, Schultz was not the bravest of the brave. When the all-clear siren came on and Klink came out of the bunker, he looked around for any damage. Still saw no Schultz. Meanwhile, Hogan knew that Klink was going to come looking for Schultz, so he had sent the large sergeant down to the tunnel where he would have to wait for nightfall. Sure enough, just moments after the sergeant had been put in the tunnel, Colonel Klink walked in. The colonel hadn't had a haircut in weeks and his coat was now torn. He looked as though he hadn't had much sleep in days either. Colonel Klink addressed Hogan and said, "Have you seen Sergeant Schultz?" Hogan did his best to hide a smile and said, "He came over to secure the barracks as he always do before an air raid and left. I haven't seen him since." "Why haven't you seen him? Wasn't he hiding down in the bunker like you were?" Klink said nothing and headed back to his office. He had nothing to say to the mouthy Colonel Hogan. He was the commandant after all, not Hogan. That night Schultz and Hogan made their way into town and found his wife and son. The three of them would have to spend the night in the tunnel. There was no choice. Schultz couldn't believe that the old tree stump outside of the fence had been the entrance to the inside tunnels. The men with Colonel Hogan had obviously been going in and out of Stalag 13 at will for some time now. But, he and his wife and son were safe in the tunnels and soon they would be on their way to freedom. It was then that the men heard that more of Germany had been taken over and that soon they would be going home. They were busy packing their bags and the mood had become very light. But, Hogan had one more job to do and he was going to have to talk to Klink about the missing Sergeant Schultz. It was going to be just another trip to Colonel Klink's office, but things would be very different today. Colonel Hogan had just taken his customary seat in front of the desk of Colonel Klink and helped him to a cigar when the sirens went off once again. As the two men started to go out the door, an inexperienced pilot dropped a bomb directly on the office. The men of Hogan's barracks ran to the office and found Hogan, who was barely alive. Klink had passed on immediately, it appeared. Newkirk lifted Colonel Hogan's head and asked him if there was anything they could do for him. Hogan shook his head and just said, "Make it back home and tell what you saw. Be safe." With that, Colonel Hogan took his last breath. Newkirk and all the men carried Hogan's body out of the rubble and brought him down into the tunnel. Sergeant Schultz couldn't believe his eyes. The man who had promised him safe passage had now died, and now what was going to happen to him and the rest of Colonel Hogan's men, he wondered. But, Newkirk took right over and spoke on the radio to the submarine, telling them what had happened. That night they met the submarine as they had many times before, but this time carrying the body of their beloved colonel. They watched as the Schultz family boarded the submarine and headed back to the camp. The camp was a total disaster now. The Germans were leaving their posts and the men of the Stalag knew that they just had to hold on for a very short time. 2 days later the Americans arrived and gave them all their freedom. Each and every one of the men at the camp were going home. They would never forget what life had been for them and the colonel that had saved their lives and made what hell for the Germans.